You're at a family dinner, half listening, and someone says, "That was 10 years ago," about something you swear happened last spring. You do the math twice because the first answer feels wrong. Everyone at the table nods like this is normal. Nobody explains why. Here's the strange part. The clock hasn't changed. A year is still 365 days, a day still 24 hours. The only thing that's moved is you. Someone will inevitably say, "Time flies," like it's just a saying, like it's not the single most disorienting thing that happens to a person slowly, year after year, without ever once asking permission. This video is about why your sense of time speeds up as you get older, and why that speed up isn't a glitch. It's your brain doing exactly what it's built to do. By the end, you'll understand why the years feel like they're accelerating toward something, and what that says about how your brain decides what a memory is even worth. French philosopher Paul Janet noticed this back in 1877, long before anyone had a word for it. His idea was simple. When you're 5, 1 year is a fifth of your entire life. When you're 50, that same year is 1/50th. Mathematically, each year keeps shrinking relative to everything that came before it. Your 10th birthday felt like forever away when you were 7. Your 40th felt like it arrived early. Divide your life into decades this way, and the first one takes up 10% of everything you've ever known, while your 7th decade barely registers as a rounding error. Janet's nephew, the philosopher Jean-Marie Guyot, is the one who actually wrote the idea down in detail. But the underlying math has stuck around for a century and a half because nobody's found a way to argue with it. Run the numbers on your own life and the pattern holds exactly. The gap between your 5th and 10th birthday feels enormous, while the gap between your 40th and 45th barely registers as a season passing. A year never gets shorter. Your ruler for measuring it does. But here's where it gets interesting. Because proportion alone doesn't explain why a single afternoon can drag at 9 years old and vanish at 35. That part lives somewhere else, in the machinery of how your brain physically processes time. In 2019, Duke University engineering professor Adrian Bajan published a theory in the European Review, arguing that time perception is tied to how fast your brain processes images. As a child, your neural pathways are short and new, so visual information moves through them quickly. You register more distinct moments per second, and your eyes make more of the tiny flicking movements called saccades. As you age, those pathways lengthen and grow more complex from decades of use, and processing slows down. You physically register fewer new frames of experience in the same stretch of time. Bajan's argument is essentially that a child's brain is recording at a higher frame rate, so a single hour contains more perceived footage than the same hour does for someone decades older. He's pointed to studies on saccade frequency showing that these tiny eye movements, which happen mostly without you noticing, do measurably slow down as neural pathways age and lengthen. It's a strange thought that the raw physical wiring of your eyes is quietly rationing out how much footage you get per year, long before memory or mood ever enters the picture. Your brain isn't playing tricks on you. It's running slower, one saccade at a time, which connects directly to something psychologist Mark Whitman at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology in Freiburg has spent years researching: the difference between time as you live it and time as you remember it. Whitman's work shows these are almost entirely separate systems. In the moment, boredom stretches time and immersion collapses it. But looking backward, the rule flips completely. It's not duration that matters, it's density. A week crammed with new experiences gets remembered as long. A week of identical routines, same commute, same desk, same 15 exact steps, gets compressed down to almost nothing, even though you lived through every hour of it. Whitman has described this as the brain keeping two entirely separate ledgers, one for how time feels while you're inside it, and one for how much of it gets written down afterward. And the two rarely agree. That's the trap. The more your life repeats, the less your memory has to hold on to, so the less time it hands back to you later. Whitman has noted that this is measurable even over a single year. Ask someone to estimate how long the past 12 months felt, and the answer correlates far more with how many new things they did than with anything else researchers have tried testing it against. But here's where it gets interesting, because this isn't just about memory density, it's about chemistry. A study led by psychologist Peter Mangan at Ohio University found that dopamine, the neurotransmitter tied to reward, attention, and your internal sense of rhythm, declines with age, roughly 10% per decade starting in your 20s. Dopamine doesn't just make things feel good. It helps regulate your body's internal clock. Less of it, and that clock appears to run faster than the one on your wall, meaning real time slips by while your internal sense of it lags behind, always catching up. Some researchers describe this as your internal metronome slowing down while the actual world keeps its tempo exactly the same. So the gap between the two just keeps widening every year without you ever feeling the moment it opened. It's part of why children reliably underestimate how long a set interval of time has lasted, while older adults reliably overestimate it in the same lab experiments, run with an actual stopwatch and no clocks in the room. Your brain's stopwatch and the world's clock stop agreeing with each other, and nobody tells you when it happened. There's also a piece of this that has nothing to do with neurons and everything to do with what you're comparing your life against. Neuroscientist David Eagleman at Baylor College of Medicine has studied how the brain builds a personal timeline almost entirely out of novelty. First kisses, first apartments, first heartbreaks, all the firsts that come stacked on top of each other in your teens and 20s. Each one gets its own vivid file, but once you've done a version of most things once, the brain stops filing new folders and starts filing new experiences into old ones. A 45th Tuesday commute doesn't get its own memory. It gets absorbed into the general folder labeled commuting, and the general folder doesn't grow. It just gets one more check mark. Eagleman's research suggests memory itself is what your brain uses to measure duration after the fact. So, a life with fewer distinct entries literally measures out as shorter, whether or not it felt that way as you lived it. In his experiments on subjective duration, people who'd been shown novel images consistently reported that a given stretch of time had lasted longer than people shown repetitive ones, even though the clock said otherwise for both groups. You're not living less. You're just running out of new folders to put things in, which is why author Claudia Hammond, who wrote an entire book on this called Time Warped, coined what she calls the holiday paradox. A trip abroad feels like it flies by while you're in it, but feels enormous in hindsight, stretched out and rich with detail, because it was so packed with things your brain had never filed before. Meanwhile, a month at home, doing the version of your life you've already lived hundreds of times, collapses into a blur the moment it's over. The paradox isn't really about vacations. It's about the fact that your brain only stamps a date on things that surprised it. Hammond has pointed out that this is why people who deliberately break their routine, even in small ways, tend to report their weeks and months as feeling fuller in hindsight than people who don't. A new route to work, an unfamiliar restaurant, a conversation with someone you'd normally never talk to. There's a smaller, stranger wrinkle worth adding here too, because none of these researchers work in isolation. Some have started asking whether the acceleration itself is even linear. A handful of surveys on subjective time, including informal ones cited by Hammond in her own work, suggest the sense of speeding up isn't a smooth slope at all, but something closer to a series of steps, with sudden jumps around major life transitions, leaving school, having a first child, retiring, moments where routine resets hard enough to briefly slow the clock back down before it starts accelerating again from a new baseline. But here's where the late pivot in this story gets uncomfortable, because the acceleration doesn't stop at some plateau in your 40s. It keeps compounding. Every year, the ratio in Janet's math gets smaller, the saccades get slower by Bejan's account, dopamine keeps declining by Mangan's numbers, and novelty gets harder to find the more of life you've already lived. Some researchers have quietly connected this to something darker than nostalgia. The years genuinely do seem to speed up toward the end of a life, which means that if time perception really does compress with age, The final decade of anyone's life might, subjectively, pass faster than any other decade before it. Not because less is happening, because the brain has stopped being surprised by any of it. And the unsettling part is that this compression is invisible from the inside. Nobody feels their own decade shrinking. They just look up one day and find the math doesn't match the memory.